Hi, I'm Helen Lee. I'm an artist, designer, and educator, and I'll be presenting Vitreous typography today. So vitreous typography, vitreous is a word that means glassy, and I am trained as a glassblower and a graphic designer. And I'll speak a little bit to my identity as an artist because I think that's probably a large distinction between myself and many of the other presenters in that my design practice has been co-opted by my artistic identity, and a lot of the design exercises I do ultimately sort of get applied in the service of a studio art practice, which might be fairly different than the context that we're seeing a lot in these presentations. This is like old grad school work in which I'm typing my artist statement, but it gives you a sense of my relationship to glass and how I like it to use it to help me understand things about language and the body. I'm going to brush through neon typography really quick because I feel like that's something that's probably like the most well-known relationship between glass and typography, in that there's an existing repertoire of glass typography in the field of neon. In my own work, I would say I dabble in neon. I'm not an expert by any means, but I have some projects that have made some use of it. For the most part, I use a fabricator just like anyone else would, but I suppose it's worth bringing up neon as a starting point to think about the fact that I'm working with glass to generate typography has a material implication and a process implication. And so as opposed to drawing a vector a billion times on a screen, there's sort of like these tubes that get bent in a fire into the shape of letter forms, which are then processed. And in the case of neon, there's sort of also lots of electricity to manage. But my primary entry point into this discussion of vitreous typography is from the perspective of being a glassblower predominantly. And the practice of glassblowing is largely axisymmetric in that radial symmetry plays a really large role in how one works with the blown vessel. So this is what my mind looks like, in that I work a lot with the sectional cut. Some of that is holdover too from having trained as an architect in undergrad. But when I look at a vessel, I sort of do this mental cut through the vessel and work with typographic forms in this way. This work is largely derivative of Ruth King and G. Lee. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, or certainly with Univers Revolve. On the left-hand side is a glass artist named Ruth King, who also rendered typography in glass. But I suppose what I hope that I'm adding this conversation is sort of what happens with the application of that. And so, King's work I see very much so in a Kossuithian tradition. And G. Lee is very much so like from the early days of computer rendering and just that possibility of suggesting what it would be to rotate a form to make it a physical object. And so in my case, there's a real material specificity to what it is to bring it into material. And I'm leveraging a lot of glass history and process history here, in that the forms are actually informed by what works with glass. And so bottoms are often thicker, lips are often thinner. These get employed in different ways in my studio practice, and sometimes they do end up being print objects. At some point along the line, I realized I could stop fighting the shadow and make use of the shadow to create the actual image of the language itself. In 2010, I was lucky enough to take a little workshop with Jeremy Mickle, who helped me improve my idea of translating glass typography into an actual typeface, and I'm still in desperate need of a professional typographer to help me bring this into full fruition. But it's fun to kind of move back and forth between these two different disciplines, so pushing that back into print. Working with languages and different systems of writing. This is the Iroha. So all of the syllabaries and hiragana are rendered in this ancient kind of vestigial antiquated poem. This is made with 40 students from Toyama City Institute of Glass Art. And I think it's important to note that glassblowing is a very collaborative activity. And so it means something different when you see a piece like that versus like really looking at the labor that went behind that and the teamwork that went into making these types of sectional cuts and glass objects. I think this is my studio motto. This is a simpler work, kind of like a little pun I made called H2O, where I'm just sort of using the curvy bracket form as a way of making a vessel that would hold water along the cut in this direction. And I suppose to the glassblower's eye, this is sort of interest because the form itself is very counter to how the glass wants to behave. I'm throwing a bunch of process shots into this presentation because I realized that this audience probably doesn't know much about the glass process. So I'm going to drop in a bunch of other categories of ways in which I think about typography through the lens of glass and glass processes. And one of those would be helical typography. And this is referencing the history of glass cane, Zanfirico filigree cane. And this is a snapshot of a program called Virtual Glass. And it's a digital way to render what the cane process, how to plan out cane so that a glassblower could have a plan before they move into the studio and make it. And so cane starts with solid pieces of color that get coated in clear and pulled and then sorted and organized. And those pieces can then be picked up and arranged in all sorts of different orientations. This is my mentor, Peter Hauk, who taught me how to make cane. And I will honestly believe, I think this method has persisted and still been so popular because it's just really fun to do. And so you pick all this up and you coat it in more hot glass and you stick it onto another post and then you pull as though you're, pulling taffy, but you twist and you add a helical twist into the pattern. It's very juicy, very satisfying, very fun to make. And in 2013, I returned to my alma mater and had an opportunity to work at the MIT Glass Lab, where I set up cane twists in the alphabet form. So this is A through Z in twisty cane. I only had 2 weeks for that residency, and so it was kind of fast and furious. At that time, I quickly made a pangram. This is obfuscated pangram. It reads, what does this read? This is pack my box with 5 dozen liquor jugs. The telltale giveaway is that those 3 strands in the middle, that O is sort of the telltale there. So what starts out sort of as typography kind of ends up being a pattern and legible in a very different orientation. And then in my identity as an artist, I'll often use this to render pieces of writing that have a different context altogether. So all of that was sort of hot glass processes, and I'll speak a little bit to warm typography. Warm would indicate processes by which the glass is warmed up and then melted into a form. I've only done a couple of projects in this particular process. One would be this, which is called Pillow Book. And in this are 18 layers of glass that contain dreams that other people have had of me. And I think Kristen McFarlane is an Australian artist who's done more work in this style. And I believe that she had studied as a graphic designer. I think she was sort of like in the style of David Carson and very distressed type. And this would be a very applicable process to explore that style of distressing type. This is my Chinese name. Another piece that I'd made was a piece that sort of tried to get at the notion of having a name that is somewhat untranslatable and also remains unspoken. And also references the word red. So this is Pyrocumulus, and it's a piece that was made out of cast glass. It was done in router because I definitely needed to work with a typeface that would accommodate the flow of glass into a cavity. So it had to be kind of thick and round. And there's always kind of a shadow implication on a lot of the work too. I included this really quick. It reads, everyone is sick in Chinese. And I guess I just included it just as a nod that even when my practice leaves the material of glass, there are still elements of what is visible, what is invisible, and how does heat act as a transformative agent as we cross from one into the other. I'm going to go back to a hot process called Marini, which I think of as like this 16th century vector technology in glass. And so a number of pieces here. This is my small homage to letterpress, M space engram and M quad phase change. The left being a glass cast of the original on the right. And this is alphabet. So this is a really large, really large type case of about 10,000 pieces of type, all 68 glyphs on a standard Latin keyboard, sorted in a pattern that is most similar to the QWERTY keyboard, but borrows some of the logic of the California job case. So it employs a 5x5 typeface that I designed and then rendered in Glass Marini. And this is about a 2-year project, so there's quite an investment of time in here. So there are 5 different sizes of type here. This is a static shot of it. The detail of the keyboard, overhead shot of the tray. And then from these units, I then made additional expressions that sort of reference different moments in the history of humans relating to communication and digital technology. Some of them are like 2x2-inch cubes. Some of them are all the way down to like 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch little slices. Some of them are like just the right side to put in a slide projector. And so then all of a sudden they can actually grow in scale. And in this way, I guess what interests me is that they retain the integrity of the information much as a vector graphic does. And the projection also is enjoyable for me because I can start to see the details of the information in the glass, in particular, the sort of large gesture here of that slump of the gravity of the glass as it's fused in a kiln. So some process shots, I sort of start with, mechanical drawing. I slice lots and lots of clear and black glass that all gets organized. This is Mother's Day a couple of years ago. I cut 1,000 pieces of glass on Mother's Day. I fuse a slug like this. I fuse lots of slugs like this. They get warmed up in a kiln to about 1,000 degrees. They get picked up. I add a little bit of clear glass onto the end of them, and that gets pulled into straight rods. Not super visible on the left, but that on the left is the cold version of what you're seeing on the right. So there's an Étoile Cherglou lockup in that kiln fusing. That again gets warmed up to 1,000 degrees, then gets picked up. A couple other lockups here. Then I'm adding a little glass to the end of that, shaping that up, putting a little handle in the end and pulling that. And what you're seeing on the right there is sort of the first pull. I then chop that up and then pull it again, just because I'm too scared to do the whole pull all at once. It's a lot of labor invested in that slug of glass there. And in the end, I end up with this small little tile of information. There's a lot of sorting to be done in the studio to manage all these pieces. If I'm really dolling them up, I'll fire polish all of them. And this is sort of what all of that raw type looks like in the studio before they're processed into small little tiles. This is a little micro sampler of the whole lockup and all the different pieces of type. And these then can also be picked up hot. And so this would sort of be the glass translation of a lockup for picking up. And this is what it looks like once you pick it up. Because this is the most predictable thing a glass person would do, I'm like not super interested in it, but it is fun to do. And once that glass cools down, it is also fragile again and eligible to be broken. There's a lot of work I do that's just material translations, using vestiges of type technology as a drawing implement in glass. And teaching is a large part of what I do as an artist. This is a workshop I ran last year as part of TypeCon. You might recognize some of those students. And so hot casting glass is another method of working with typography and glass, translating a vector into a CNC piece of wood, into a sand mold, into glass that's poured into that sand mold. Equally can be done with a hand-built mold or freeform graphite molds. As well as just using bubble entrapment. So laying down a layer of glass, making an impression in that, laying another layer of glass down to make the letter form in a bubble itself. And then just sort of a free form hot pour. So this is Kara's really lovely, wonderful, I'm gonna call it a ladle script B. And these are the outcomes of that workshop at TypeCon last year. Heliotypography and hydrotypography. And so for me, the term glass artist has this very particular connotation, but in my case, I think of my practice as an act of writing with glass, and by extension, an act of writing with light and writing with shadow. And I'm moving into the idea of writing with water as well. This is an older piece called Announcement. I'm sorry, this is a 1943 heliograph from World War II. It was used by the British Army to signal communications long distances, and so it's a signaling mirror. It's a triptych piece, so it came with some accessory mirrors. And so I'm using this to signal my daughter's birth announcement. So this message reads, Cicada Wenzone Clark, born January 21st, 2015. Oh my gosh, I've forgotten her birth announcement. It cites her weight, her length, and then mother and baby are well. This is a project, this one specifically is Heliotypography. This is my earlier prototypes working by flexing the surface of glass to create this reflection of sunlight with the ultimate intention of making installations of type in the built environment like this. This is sort of the upgraded version of that, where I'm slowly starting to be able to articulate that without having to have my hand in there. And more recently, I'm currently a finalist for a Momentum intersection opportunity where I'm working with some of the most recent technologies in flat glass and coatings to render that work and also begin working with type that becomes legible through different moisture conditions. This work, I'm gonna kind of end with this. This is just a nice way to end. The context for this piece was a collaboration called Carried on Both Sides. That was a deep meditation into the @ symbol, the history of which goes back to the Roman trading empire and the @ symbol as a symbol for a terracotta vessel that was used as a unit of measure in trade. And this project went all over the place. There was Kevlar clothing holding weird pieces of glass that then went into the ocean and such and such. But one nice outcome of this was thinking about the @ symbol and its future possibilities, and that perhaps it could have two states of being, one as the symbol itself, and two unfurled in the idea that perhaps a glyph, particularly in its current role in society as this prepositional indicator of identity, perhaps that indicator could also indicate our state of being, whether we are active or at rest. And a lot of times the work deviates from typography strictly and is more an interpretation of how glass and language might move through the world. That's all. You can find more about my work at pinknoise.org, or I'm on Instagram as Hot Pink Noise. And thanks so much for your time. So do I field questions now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, anyone in the chat, feel free to throw a couple questions in there. If I may, I am going to go ahead and start. I do just want to say that was really wonderful. And I just have to know, what got you so interested in using glass as a form of communication?
That's a good question. I started working with glass a really long time ago. So I was a teenager, and I kind of went to like I have stumbled upon it through a summer art camp when I was 16, and then that was the first time I was introduced to the idea that glass was a material that one could learn how to shape on your own, and I was very entranced by it, but it's a very obscure medium and hard to come by. And I did not really find another place to study it until I went to undergrad at MIT, where they had an extracurricular program in glass. And so um, I studied architecture there, but I basically spent all of my time learning how to blow glass while I was a student at MIT. And I think over the course of 4 years there, I applied for like every student scholarship to take classes elsewhere in the summer. And so I spent all of my summers trying to learn glass, and the material itself and just the idea that one could shape that was my main investment in it. And after I became somewhat proficient in that, it took a while before I came around to really wanting to pursue an MFA. And it was during my time as an MFA student, I sort of, forged together this identity as an artist in which I think I was drawing by that time. I had already had some degree of experience in graphic design, and I had studied a lot of writing too. So this is some way of pulling together a number of different interests and drawing my material expertise towards my interest in sort of thinking about the graphic and physical space of language, as well as like being bilingual, as well as being interested in writing. So there are many ways in which that felt right. Is it okay for me to just like answer things that I'm seeing in the chat window?
Yeah,
okay.
Please do.
Okay. How do you get funded? I love this question. Thank you for asking this. There have been different stages of how I've funded my career. And so prior to 2013, I made all of my bread and butter money to support myself in the field of graphic design. And so, I'm not by any means a very interesting designer. I don't think I worked as like a freelance production designer, typesetting things for boutique design firms and, bougie cookbooks for Chronicle and stuff like that. And so I did freelance graphic design, and then I maintained a studio practice in addition to that in my own spare time. And in 2013, I was living in the Bay Area at the time and trying to find a way to escape that financial doom. And so I accepted a job to take on the role of running the glass lab at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that's a research university. And so since then, my studio practice has been really well supported by research funding from the university predominantly. And it's really interesting because the balance has really shifted, whereas prior to having this role, which has, obviously amazing support, the key thing that I really had before was like all this time. And now I have like no time at all, but lots of monetary support, which is really helpful for some of the labor intensive projects. What was your motivation for the glass pillow? Because it was more conceptual at first than some of the other work. Yeah, so someone recently pointed out to me that my projects are either this like totally dorky geek out on language and type and letters and such, or they draw from really intense personal narratives. And the pillow book would be one that falls into that latter category. And that I didn't sort of go in depth into a lot of the detail about the pieces that are really more firmly rooted in my art practice. But that piece was part of a series of works in an exhibition in 2015 where it was called The Cloud, and it was actually the first time I ever addressed my cultural background, which is something that I kind of like, I just had always avoided talking about in my work. And it was because I had a kid, I kind of like couldn't avoid talking about it anymore. And so that piece was about my experience losing my mother, because I kind of committed to just, you know, really taking my time and mourning that loss. And in that time, one of the things that I noticed was I was like really deep in grief. And so people that I met, conversations that I had, all of that was like very blurry in my waking life and my sleeping life. Like it all felt the same to me. But in that time, people would like email me that they had a dream about me. And it was really surreal to me to have these experiences where my presence in other people's subconscious was clear while my conscious waking life was very unclear. And so that was kind of the impetus for that work, was like trying to reconcile that oddness in a form. And it's something of a nod to the ancient ceramic funereal pillows from Chinese culture as well. I'd always loved those forms and wanted to have one to call my own. So that was the origin of Pillow Book. I think my work is art that employs design. I mean, it's both. It's yes and. You know, I often get the question of like, oh, where do you show your work? Or, you know, there's this very small glass world. There's a larger world of contemporary art. There's sort of other design outposts and such. And I'm interested in all of it. I mean, I think what makes the work interesting is that it doesn't fit neatly into any one of those categories. I mean, I predominantly identify as an artist. As a craftsperson, I predominantly identify as a glassblower. I think of design as like something that I employ in those identities and a way in which I like reason through an idea or troubleshoot something. It's rare that the identity of designer comes first when people introduce me. And it's kind of interesting, like when I see, when I look at other designers who have works like, you know, G. Lee's Universe Revolved, or even Helen Lee's, you know, extensive work in 3D printed ceramics and such. I think the distinction is that after I design out a system of language, I then care a lot about when, how, and where it gets used and what the utility of it is. Whereas I feel like a lot of the other exploits that I've seen with designers sort of flirting with material, one, oftentimes the understanding of material is not quite as intimate as it is if you spend, say, 2 decades working in that material. But two, it kind of just stops at like, well, I made the system and there it is. But I get a little more specific in that, like I make the system and then I really care a lot about like how I use the system. And that it has a very specific application that, like, for me, feels like it's like just made for that. Is the tangible aspect of the glass important for you? What do you mean by the tangible aspect of the glass? I'm not sure if I understand that.
Just to throw a guess, maybe the fact that it's a physical object and a physical space to work with, as opposed to sort of a two-dimensional form of text.
Cool. Thanks. Sorry, thank you. Yeah, it is important to me as a craftsperson and someone who's always been invested in things and how things are made and being a maker of things. And I think it's also important because in a lot of the artwork, there are ways in which the work is asking the viewer to reconcile that space between what we see and what we physically know, or how we, the space between sort of, you know, the ontological versus epistemological divide, but like, trying to negotiate, like, you know, is what, when you come across, for example, some of the vitreous typography that's like those blown vessels that are cut in half, like, is it an object, is it a vessel, or is it language, or is it all of those things? And like, where's the divide between that? Something about that tangibility feels really important, in that the viewers really have to encounter it in physical form, like they have to relate to it like with their body. And that moment of like uncertainty or confusion is like, I think a really, it's really dependent on that tangible encounter. So it does feel pretty important to me. And like from a design perspective too, like here's the part where I feel like there's like a finer point on the fact that I am a craftsperson that has like super hyper experienced levels of skill with the material, and that the design is highly influenced with that really like privileged knowledge of the material.
Just another question that I personally had for you. I saw that at the end of the presentation, you were sort of talking about taking a look at the @ symbol, not just as the symbol itself, but also flattened out or unfurled rather. I'm very, very interested in that. And do you have any ideas with where you're going to go with that, or just anything to talk about there?
Yeah, so that project, I forgot to mention in the recording, but it was a collaboration with 3 other artists, Carolyn Woolard, Lika Volkova, and Alexander Rosenberg. And so it was sort of a sprawling collaboration, and it was collaborative in the sense that we were all ideating around this same conceptual topic of the past, present, and future of the @ symbol. And that particular notion was like a speculative future for the @ symbol, where we were sort of imagining like what else it could be. I wouldn't really say that it's a project that's like still active or going anywhere else, but I do love the thought that like that just that suggestion of like could the very identity of a glyph start to change, where like a glyph could sort of have like 2 stages or 2 states of being. And like that's like a really exciting thing where like I definitely don't have the technical expertise to make that happen, but you know, anyone who does, like take that idea and make it happen, because I think it'd be really cool if all of a sudden like everything we know about what a glyph is and how it functions, you know, and what we're used to through technological interfaces starts to like shift really. And that idea came from a lot of the work in that project started to shift towards these suggestions of the @ symbol in the future, kind of negating the way in which contemporary technology is asking us to be available and online all the time and sort of constantly accessible. And we were trying to imagine ways in which the symbol could start to negate that. And so that perhaps the symbol could indicate like, this is my identity, but that also like, perhaps I'm not available right now. Or even, you know, I think one of the awkward things about social media and the way in which we have personas now online is like when people pass away, it's actually like, it's quite awkward, right? It's really awkward. And so that perhaps this could be like a glyph that indicates like this identity online has like now deceased, you know? So it's more just sort of a thought experiment that none of us in the actual original collaborative team have the necessarily like the technical chops to make that happen. But I love the idea of that spreading to someone who does. Yeah, in the Marini, so I have considered that. And one of the things that, you know, there's actually quite a few glass artists that have done alphabets before. But because they're glass artists and not type designers, their alphabets are like totally inconsistent. There's nothing about them that can like correlate directly to a typeface. It's just all hand slab drawn, whatever. And so I guess that's sort of why I went the route that I went. And it seems likely to me that like most future endeavors of mine in which I'll be trying to render a typeface in glass will still try to attain that level of being systematic that one would have as a designer. That being said, I have tried, I have wanted to do sort of like extruded castings that could be assembled together and picked up, but it's just sort of never made its way back up to the priority list. But I, like way back in the early days of when waterjet was still a new technology, that was sort of like a thing that I tried. And I do have some friends that have done things similarly. And I guess the only other thing too that I kind of care a lot about is like at what point does it matter if it's glass, right? Because if I can water jet cut sort of like the positive and negative of any particular outline and pick that up and pull it, at what point does it matter if it's glass? And so I think that's another factor that I think about too. So yes, I'm interested in that. I haven't done it exactly, but I've like started to toe the waters of that, and I'm not sure at what point that will kind of become a thing that feels really important for me to try to do. These are lovely questions. Thanks, everyone. It's fun to talk to a new audience.
Another thing that you mentioned in the presentation briefly was you'd use the heat with the glass and the fire with the I guess that was maybe parchment or cloth of some kind. You also mentioned using water moving forward. Did you have any ideas to expound upon as far as that goes?
Yeah, so right now I'm one of the finalists for this residency through Momentum Intersection out of Toledo. And we've gotten all these samples to play with. So there's this glass manufacturer that specializes in different coatings in glass. And some of the coatings, they're really interesting coatings, but some of the coatings change how water behaves on the surface of the glass. And so the water might bead up on it differently or sheet off of it differently. And so I'm actually collaborating right now with Alice Chow to try to figure out, the right convergence of, a typeface design and some sort of written content with a particular specially coated glass. And that's sort of as far as I've gotten there. And it's fun to sort of, I know there's sort of like a lot of projects in the field of type design that have already played with like Rain-X type products and stuff. But this will actually be sort of more integral to the material itself, in that it's like a industrially manufactured glass product with a coating like baked into it. Yeah.
Wow, well, that sounds super interesting. I'll definitely have to keep my ear to the ground. Is anyone in the chat here still wanting to get a question in real quick here? Or while we're waiting, Helen, did you have any other things you wanted to add?
I don't think so. The main thing I felt regretful for not including in the talk was the name of the other collaborators of that last project, but I got that in already. It's mostly just fun for me to get to interact a little bit with, a group of designers, as it's definitely not my home territory.
Excellent. Well, I know we're definitely all super glad to have you. And I definitely encourage everybody to go ahead and move the conversation to the Hangout room. Always more opportunities for questions and conversation there. Definitely want to say thank you so much, Helen. This has been fantastic. And yeah, we really appreciate you having this presentation.
Thanks so much for having me.
All righty, everyone, take care now.